gentlemen, welcome, and a special welcome to Major General Sylvain Ménard, who at this moment is a founder of Symbiostrated Consultants and a senior advisor with Prospectus. I Googled Symbiote Strat and I couldn't find a thing. So perhaps at one stage in the game, you can tell us, because the name is intriguing. But prior to that, served over 35 years Canadian Armed Forces, has logged over 2,600 flight hours, has served in Afghanistan and Libya. And more tellingly, in today's context, he has overseen procurement over $60 billion in air defense projects. And I understand that defense procurement is something that he is currently engaged in on the civilian side. Graduate of U.S. Air War College and RMC. Sylvain, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, Angela. It is truly a pleasure to be with you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by congratulating Rousey on its 105th anniversary. Pretty impressive. And I want to thank you for what you do day in, day out. Now, I understand that Rousey has had several illustrious retired military generals and serving military generals and speakers, many of which are from an army background. So for everyone listening this evening, I was basically asked to bring a bit more of a light blue Air Force flavor in our discussions today so that we can maybe collectively share a different perspective on the essence of where we stand as a proud and noble nation. I would like to start by using the CDS words from a few weeks ago at the Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense, which occurred in Ottawa on 5th and 6th of March 2025. And over there in her keynote address, she mentioned that the world evolves in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment where international world order is challenged more than we have ever seen since World War II, where disinformation and weaponized uncertainty seem to be the new norm. During his keynote address at the same conference, our Minister of National Defense, Minister Blair, was rightfully noting that Canada has been overcomplacent on the required investment in our Canadian Armed Forces, in our sovereignty, and in our independence. Now, it's in this context only 4 days and a bit from the elections that I want to take a step back and discuss the military threats facing Canada's national security, often quietly, yet with significant implication for our sovereignty. You will also notice that I will not address the current trade conflict with our southern neighbors. I will focus on the one point that unites us both of our nations, as I'm a firm believer that there's more that unites us than divides us at the end of the day when we talk about security. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the last few years, since 2014, the world's entropy has been increasing on the military front and on the climate change front at an impressive scale, which all have been exacerbated with high inflation rates and increased financial pressures at the micro and macro level, all of this contributing to what many call the dangerous decade, the decade that we are in from now until 2030. So in order to contextualize the Royal Canadian Air Force modernization efforts, which are complementary to what the Royal Canadian Navy and the Canadian Army are doing, I will focus my comments today on 4 key threats that we should be extremely concerned about as Canadians and world citizens, as we no longer can claim to live in a world where the threat is far, far away in another continent and where we live in a safe haven isolated by 3 seas which protect us. The threats that we'll cover are at anti-access area denial, the threat to the Arctic and the associated domestic challenges, uncrewed aerial systems, and finally hypersonic missiles. So I will download a whole bunch of information. I'll speak for about 22 minutes or so, and then I hope to engage in a rich discussions and answer questions, ready to get to the point of it, so that we can grow together. So the first of the 4 threats that I want to discuss is anti-access area denial, or A2AD. Modern military technology is required to uphold A2AD, and therefore it's almost exclusively practiced by advanced regional powers such as Russia and China. More specifically, China wants to deny Western military access and operational capabilities at the Taiwan Strait, South China Seas, and the East China Seas so that Beijing can have total control and operational superiority in these areas. Recently, these powers have employed A2AD in disputed regions like Crimea and the South China Sea to disrupt freedom of navigation for the international community. Russia and China's use of A2AD directly opposes the local and regional interests of the Western world, notably the US and its allies, leaving the Canadian Armed Forces vulnerable when operating in these disputed regions. Now, as you can see on the slide, Canada has indeed been operating in these regions with operations such as Up Neon, Up Horizon, and Up Projection. In response to Canadian presence, China has shown aggression and hostile intent towards our proximity to the disputed territories, territorial waters, and airspace by flying dangerously close to our aircraft, almost setting them in flight, buzzing our own ships. In order to avoid such dangerous escalation and having no way to push back, Canada and our allies are restricted in operation in these regions. More importantly, A2AD is the direct threat to the freedom of navigation and the international trade as we know it, which affects us, Canada, as we are surrounded by 3 seas. And it also threatens the international order. The second threat that I would like to rapidly discuss is the Arctic threat and the resulting domestic challenges. The Russian Northern Fleet and the long-range aviation are employed to secure Russia's Arctic borders, asset power status, support territorial, resource, economic threats, and to counter and deter NATO forces. They are used for A2AD, monitoring for strategic exercises and deployments of highly capable Russian military equipment. The Northern Sea route would provide the Kremlin as an opportunity to diversify its policy, its energy policy, and by linking the Russian Arctic continent to the markets in Asia, thus reducing their reliance on European energy and markets. Russia is heavily investing to refurbish airfields and port infrastructure. As a reminder, Russia possesses by far the world's largest icebreaker fleet. Rising temperature and subsequent melting of ice will make oil and gas reserves more accessible, and through employment of its northern fleet, icebreaker fleet, port and airfield infrastructure, the Kremlin can help ensure that Russia's state obtains a steady source of revenues as well as market and geopolitical influence in Europe and Asia. The Northern Sea route, which runs from the Kara Gate to the Bering Strait, represents an opportunity for the Kremlin to create an energy superhighway for the export and trade of hydrocarbons and other natural resources. To ensure the development of the route, Russia has approved a $29 billion US development plan in August 2022, effective until 2035. This plan will create a robust supply chain through the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation to ensure the unhindered supplies of goods to the ports and the new points of economic growth. It's important to note that due to the over-reliance on the Suez Canal and the Strait of Malacca, China too has emerged as an active actor in the Northern Sea Route Development Program. Major highlight of their joint involvement with Russia include investment into port infrastructure, including deep water ports, natural gas production, liquefaction, shipping facilities, and crude oil processing facilities. Russia, with the support of China, in order to protect their own growing asset in the north and the sovereignty of their waters, has increased efforts to improve A2AD, monitoring surveillance capabilities, and has increased its tempo of operational patrols while upgrading its military infrastructure to support these operations. In 2014, Russia created the Arctic Joint Strategic Command for the primary purpose of providing enhanced protection to existing and planned military installation along the Northern Sea route. Really, in a sense, it's militarizing all the islands close to what we call our sovereign territory along the north. Examples include the deployment of the Bastion P supersonic anti-shipping missile system and the Pantsir SI medium-range self-propelled surface-to-air missiles on the Kotelny and Novaya Zemlya Islands, respectively. Furthermore, Russia is upgrading and building several new airfields in the Arctic to become fully functional at these sites. For example, in March 2021, a pair of MiG-31s made a demonstration flight over Russia's northernmost base called Nagoskoye. The Northern Fleet, home based in Severomorsk on the Kola Peninsula, houses 11 nuclear submarines and several major surface combatant ships. These ships and submarines perform deployment through the GI-UK gap or the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, which could pose an increased threat to NATO sea line of communications. Additionally, the air bases of Ukrainka and Engels houses the Tu-95 Bear and the Tu-160 Blackjack tactical bombers who have performed regular incursions into NATO countries' airspace, including in Canada. In fact, our CF-18s are used regularly on a yearly basis to go and intercept these bombers as they test our responses. These aircraft can carry nuclear-armed long-range ballistic missiles. These assets, along with the naval assets of the Northern Fleet, are the main instruments of Russian power projection in the region and present the Allies with a unique and tailored force capable of a wide variety of operations with the goal to deter NATO forces and therefore Canada from operating in the Northern Atlantic and the Arctic regions. In addition, the Russian icebreaker fleet plays a critical role in securing the Northern Sea route by clearing passages for military and commercial vessels, serving as mobile scientific platform for the Arctic research, and when necessary, arming these ships with caliber cruise missiles and electronic warfare suites. We should pay very close attention and concerns ourselves with what our northern neighbors are doing in our backyard up in the north. The third threat that I want to discuss today is the Uncrewed Aerial System, or UAS. Due to their proliferation, based on cost, effectiveness, and mobility, there's an increased threat of UAS being employed by adversary state actors, non-state actors, and terrorist groups to conduct many different types of operations, including intelligence collection, explosive delivery, and chemical weapons delivery. Most recently, consistent with Russia's military doctrine, they have employed UAS extensively in ISR missions, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, which has enabled them to play a dominant role in artillery, counter-battery, and precision strike missions during the invasion of Ukraine. The employment of commercial drones have addressed pressing ISR needs and serve as rudimentary loitering ammunitions. Their proliferation and success has prompted Russian military initiative to provide Russian soldiers, every Russian soldiers, to the lowest rank to the highest rank, with standardized tactic, techniques, and procedure for UAS usage. In the Ukrainian conflict, UAS have been seen as expandable, single-use platforms for inflicting maximum damage on military sites and platforms and military personnel. However, despite the acknowledged importance, Russia has been very slow to produce UAS in significant number on a large scale. To address these challenges of production, Russians are using Iranian-produced military drones extensively. These drones have a range of hundreds of kilometers, including anti-jamming systems, which make them more robust and very difficult to counter. In recent years, Al-Qaeda, Jakarta-based militant, and Daesh have either attempted to employ UAS or have transferred UAS technologies in tactics. The detection of drones is critical for interdiction. However, US employment present a unique challenge in the sense that these systems are very difficult to detect and track since they typically have a very small radar cross-section. Continued improvement of US technology will continue to challenge these detection systems, and it's very easy to foresee that in Canada, on our brand new F-35 base, with a very inexpensive fleet of drones with a small explosive payload, you could easily neutralize one of the two of our fighter bases or both fighter bases simultaneously. That's why we need to concern ourselves with these threats. The fourth and the last threat that I will cover this evening is hypersonic missiles. In the foreseeable future, one of the major threats faced by the air domain will involve hypersonic missiles. While hypersonic refers to speed above Mach 5 or 5 times the speed of sound, hypersonic missiles and weaponry openly operate mostly within the Earth's atmosphere to maneuver using their aerodynamic features, thus causing unpredictable flight paths. This combination of extreme speed, maneuverability, and long range distinguishes them from the ballistic missile counterpart, which often has a set trajectory that can relatively easily be calculated by ballistic missile defense. Adversarial states currently involved in the development of hypersonic missile technology include China and Russia. China possesses a hypersonic glide vehicle, or HGV, called the DF-17, with a solid fuel medium-range ballistic missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers. A hypersonic glide vehicle is a missile warhead that can alter its trajectory of the missile throughout the flight until reaching its target, making it very hard to detect, to predict, and to intercept. Additionally, in 2021, a report published by the United States Department of Defense indicates that the newly developed Chinese DF-27 hypersonic missile now has a class range between 5,000 and 8,000 kilometers. China, therefore, is heavily invested in developing hypersonic missile technology for offensive and defensive applications, and it's holding us at risk. If it's not obvious to the listeners today, a range of 8,000 kilometers from Russia puts almost the entirety of Canada at risk. Like China, Russia has been pursuing the continuous development and improvement of its hypersonic missile capabilities, and they're fielded as we speak today. The Kinzhal, one of Russia's hypersonic missile, has been used multiple times in Ukraine. It is an aircraft-launched modified version of an Islander M missile capable of limited maneuvers. Russia's hypersonic missile arsenal also includes the Avangard and the Tsirgon missile. The Avangard is a nuclear-armed HGV that is mounted on a launch and mounted and launched from an ICBM and could reportedly reach speeds of over Mach 20 over intercontinental distances. The lack of advanced detection and the lack of NORAD policy against hypersonic weaponry, including their ability to be used by air, land, or sea to strike its target from any direction, constitute by far the biggest vulnerabilities from a government of Canada's standpoint. NORAD policy and sensor modernization is absolutely required to detect at range and defeat hypersonic weaponry. To that end, the newly announced partnership with Australia to field our own over-the-horizon radar is way overdue, and we need to ensure that the schedule doesn't slip as many of our projects do, so that we can field it. Now, you will say, well, what's the chance that they would use this against Canada? I would like to say that from a potential adversary's perspective, there's no difference between Canada, the limit between Canada and the United States. They need to fight their way through Canada to get to the US, and that's why we need to conserve ourselves, especially that 90% of the Canadian population is within 200 kilometers of the southern border with the United States. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a very short brief. I'm happy to expand on it as we hit the question period. But in no means is it comprehensive. I hope it's substantiated, though, that the assertion in the Royal Canadian Air Force strategy that the threat to Canada's sovereignty and interest abroad, created by competition for global power and advancing technology, remains as significant now as in any time in our history. At its core, the RCF strategy remains the guidepost to build the RCF that Canada needs, an agile, integrated, and inclusive Airspace force that can be relied upon to achieve an operational advantage. As a reminder, the role of the RCAF is all about increased lethality and improved overmatch. And it's really, our role is to effectively detect and deter the threat, and when called upon, fight and win conflict to protect Canada and Canadians. Canada is building an RCF that is concept-driven, threat-informed, and digital and net-enabled to achieve information dominance and decision superiority. To achieve a true operational advantage over our potential adversaries, the RCF will continue to privilege key themes such as reach, lethality, overmatch, interoperability, and security. Now, to give you a quick idea of what the RCF is doing, it's a busy slide, and I don't intend to go through it in its entirety, but I want to just, graphically show that the RCF of 2035 will be drastically different from the RCF of today, with the majority of the RCF's fleet recapitalizing between 2026 and 2032, and with all the cross-cutting enablers that underpin the core RCF warfighting elements becoming totally transformed. And really leading the charge into this and the forcing function to propel the RCF and the Canadian Armed Forces into 5th-gen operation is the F-35 Alpha. And the first F-35 with the Canadian flags will be delivered in the United States in 2026 so that we can start training our pilots and our ground crew, I should say as well. The PAN domain C2 imperative is clearly stated on the slide here. It's all about command and control. And we need to increase our digital sophistication and make sure that, that we get ready for the future challenges of tomorrow. Between now and 2035, the RCF will also be recapitalizing many of its legacy command and control system, its ISR capabilities, and its space capabilities. And this digitalization imperative is quite honestly existential in nature. I guess what we need to take from this slide is that the RCF that we have today will be an Air Force that is in transition until the mid-2030s at the earliest. And, you know, should anything go bad very rapidly, you go with the Air Force and the armed forces that you have on any given day. So we need to expedite as much as we can the modernization of the RCAF. A few final thoughts before we get to the discussions point, and I, as promised, it's right now 6:24 your time. On this slide, I just want to mention that for me, as a next uniform member, and I would call myself as one of the subject matter expert on national security, is that it is music to my ears that we finally have a discussion on sovereignty and national security. Ladies and gentlemen, for the last 3 elections, and I don't want to get political, but the words sovereignty and the words national security have not even been mentioned. And we did talk about what happened in 2014 in Crimea and what has happened since in Ukraine, what's happened in the Middle East. To me, a nation like Canada from the G7 that relies on its alliance, on NORAD and NATO for its defenses, we need to be talking about national security, sovereignty, and how much we will invest into our military. Now, talking about investment, and given the fact that Canada lives or dies by its alliance, because we rely on NORAD and we rely on NATO for sovereignty, is that we need to invest properly as per the expectations. Now, when we signed the NORAD agreement in May 1958, Canada was spending 4.2% of its GDP. And there's a few numbers that varied, but I purposefully used the most conservative number. So some folks are saying that when you include everything it was spending back then, it was up to 7.4% of GDP. And I get it. It was very close to the World War II. But in 1973, we did below 2%, and we've been below or hovering around that number ever since. I'm a firm believer that Canada has way more to offer than a strong military, and we're not a militarized nation by nature. We're a peaceful nation, and we pride ourselves for our values. That said, if we want to have a strong diplomacy and being able to affect the world, we need to have the military power to back up our diplomacy. Because diplomacy without a military strength to enforce our words is really empty words. We should also always collectively think about defending what we have the most precious before we go and get involved in expeditionary operation. And really, that's Canada itself, the second largest landmass surrounded by 3 seas. It's no easy feat for any military to defend. It would not be an easy feat for any military of any side to defend it. But for a military of our size, I would say that we are extremely vulnerable to any type of threat to our nation. So we need to think about, and going back to the first principle, the responsibility of any government, first and foremost, is the protection of its population. And how do we do that in a country like Canada's? By having a strong military that can help with military peer-on-peer conflict, but that is also there to address all the climate change extreme events that we see on a more frequent matter from year to year. Really, at the end of the day, when the provinces cannot cope with what's happening, the first entity that they call is the Canadian military. So we need to invest more in our military. And if you ask me about priorities into what we should invest in, I'm more than happy to give you my thought on the military capabilities. But at the end of the day, for us to remain relevant, to remain credible as a nation, and to exercise deterrence, all of that is solely dependent on one single variable that is, I believe, one of our greatest weaknesses right now is the national procurement process. all parties are kind of currently discussing that we need to improve it. I know PSPC is conducting a study of how we're going to improve, but we must fix it once and for all. The pace of technology insertion in the world today is such that we simply cannot keep up with a convoluted, extremely slow acquisition system. We need to remain on par or abreast in front of the growing threat. And finally, because I hear often that in Canada, investing in the military doesn't buy votes. Maybe not, but investing in defense is just that. It's an investment in our economy, an investment in our sovereignty, and in our security. And for us to be prosper economically, I think we could do much better if we invested a bit more in our defense sector, having a defense industrial strategy so that our companies can invest in research and development so that they are ready to bid on the multi-billion dollars that the Crown will expand on the defense of our nation, because it's clear that we're going to meet a 2% NATO minimum threshold investment in the military, and I think that we're going to go above it. All the European nations now are aiming at 3.5% of their GDP. So that's kind of what I wanted to share as my final thoughts. And I, again, don't want to cry wolf, but several thousands of years ago, the concept that if you want a peace, you must prepare for war is still valid today, especially in the world that we live in. And I'm a fan of JFK, and I know that right now talking about anything American is a bit of a social faux pas, and people are emotional about what's happening. But I think it's worth mentioning that JFK had several very sound arguments. And one of the thought that he said is that it's an unfortunate fact that we can only secure peace by preparing for war. And in the world of real politics that we live in, I'm sure that the Ukrainians would totally believe would totally actually support this saying. Now, in closing, before I open up the floor, I'm a firm believer that the RCF needs to leverage its allied experience, academia, and industry expertise if we want to succeed in the modernization journey to remain ahead of the threat, as I discussed. As a former uniformed member, as I often thanked for my service, which my peers and I are definitely appreciated and appreciative. But this evening, I'd like to conclude my presentation by thanking you all, the attendees here of this brief. The fact that you're here means that you care. And ladies and gentlemen, our faith is intertwined, and we must remember that democracy is a participatory sport, not a spectator one. Together, we need to ensure that our national discussions on sovereignty, national defense, and the state of military is active. We need to talk about it often. And then we need to collectively decide where we want to go as a nation. It is paramount for us to do so if we are to defend our national interest and protect our values and uphold the international system based on democracy, the rule of law, and multilateral cooperation. Ukraine and the current state of the world are somber reminders that we cannot take this international system for granted, and that we must stand for what we are ready to defend what we so dearly value. And ladies and gentlemen, no longer can we take peace for granted. I want to thank you for your attention. This is what I had prepared to generate, hopefully, questions and great discussions. Thank you.
Well, Sylvain, thank you very much. There are a number of questions on the chat box, but I will pull rank and ask the first question. I attended a seminar today at Stimson down in the States, and they talked about the new axis of evil, China, CRINC. It's called China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And when I look at the threats that you posed early on in your lecture, namely the A2AD and Arctic, I'm curious whether or not you see any kind of collaboration between two members of CRINC, namely China and Russia. Russia is a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but it's the only big player in it. China is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is more security than defense, but it too is the one and only member. So in your threat assessment, do you see any kind of collaboration or coordination between China and Russia? as it looks to gain command control over the North Sea route? Or do you see two separate actors who may coincidentally or otherwise leverage the collective threat against Canada and its allies?
Yeah. So I've been talking about Russia a lot today, and Russia's been a long has been around for a long time, and it's very judicious in what it does. But I think it's also very opportunistic to see where national interests align with Russia, and national interests for them. I mean, I find it fascinating that that China calls itself a near Arctic nation. If it's not to lay a claim to the Arctic and what's happening, and to exploit it for their own benefits. They have a very large population and large desire to grow and to be master of their own destiny, which by itself is noble. It's just the way they go about it. If we look at what's happening in the South China Seas and how they are claiming international waters as sovereign waters, well, I see a similar trend to, maybe not to claim for their own, but to ensure that they will support Russia in their, superhighway in the Arctic to make sure that they have access to it. So in that sense, they align themselves on several portfolio, and they are investing together in what we see as the militarization of that Russia is doing in all the islands as they infringe and they get closer to the North Pole.
Are you suggesting then that China may use Russia as a leader, as a subordinate partner?
No, I would not say as a subordinate partner. I would say as equal with specific interests that are aligning. And I think that securing, the Northern Sea route for China is very advantageous, and Russia sees it as well. So they will work collaboratively on that front. I think that Mr. Putin would not agree in any way, shape, or form that he is subordinated to China, nor would China agree to it. I think it's more peer on peer. How do we work together for these specific interests that align for this specific case?
Thank you. Fred Moret, you have a question. The floor is yours.
Mon général, bonsoir. Je suis un Québécois transplanté à Calgary. Je suis un ancien blindé. I spent most of my career in armored recce. And my question tonight has to do with the lack of political leadership across the different parties to recognize the threats that most of our senior leadership has been talking about of what's going to be coming out in about 5 years. And to sum it up in one sentence, U.S. disengages from Europe, gives a green light to Putin because of the outcome in Ukraine. In 5 years or so, Russia steps into Europe, the Baltics, etc. Canada is on the front lines. So the question really is, and nobody in Canada is addressing this right now head on, right? How do you assess the physical threat to Canada, considering advances, and as you mentioned as well, in hypersonics, range, precision are improving, consistently. Economic targets in Canada, I think, could be something that we'd be looking at. Energy infrastructure, the oil sands, seaports, etc. How do you assess this?
Well, if there's one thing that keeps me up at night as a citizen now, but as an ex-military member of 35 years, is the fact that we don't talk about the threat. For some reason, it seems to be perceived as un-Canadians. We do not want to scare the population, and we stick our head in the sand. And that's why when I was in uniform, and I can talk because several generals in uniform start with the threat. We were told for the longest time when I was a junior officer, it's not your job to talk about the threat. It's government responsibility to educate the Canadian population. You will notice that all generals now, all service chiefs, are actually starting with threat when they brief. Why? I can speak for myself. I would not dare put words in the mouth of my still serving general officers, but because our government doesn't do it, we are not taking a responsibility. And related to this is that we are forgetting the price we paid for peace, And we seem to be avoiding to recognize what's happening in the world. I called it the dangerous decade in my opening comments, right? Because all military, this is not I guess military uniform member, but all military expert and subject matter expert from universities around the world call this decade the dangerous decade, because really I would equate it to to a room that is filling up with gas and we're just waiting for someone to light it. And the U.S. is counting down when China is gonna go into Taiwan, and then from then on, we're gonna see a domino effect, and obviously all CRINC countries will be involved, and the Western world, all the NATO and the U.S. Will have its hands full, because we have great capabilities. We have exquisite capabilities, but if I take the U.S. as still the challenging superpower in the world, they represent 4% of the world's population, by far exquisite capabilities, but what they lack is capacity. The US lacks capacity. They can do pretty extraordinary things, but in a limited capacity, even for the United States. And tackling China, as well as Russia, as well as Iran wanting to get back to Israel, and what's happening in the Middle East with North Korea, who knows how they're going to go when they see an opportunity to do what they need to do. They simply just don't have. And even all the NATO alliance, all the NATO countries together, and I'm glad to see NATO growing, but we need to just be ready to actually remain, I guess, the free world's police force, if you will, just because we don't talk about it. So to get back to your question, yes, I agree with your statement that we don't talk about it in Canada. I don't understand why, because I have been part of several briefs to our leaders, and for some reason, there seem to be a reticence to tell the Canadian populations the way they see it. And just in my personal private circles with my family, they ask a lot of questions that I tell them the way it is, what's at there. Like today, we can consider ourselves at war cybernetically. Like on the cyber front, we are at war every given day. There are several thousands, hundreds of thousands of attacks to our infrastructure on a daily basis. Just to give you an example, when I was the base commander between 2013 and 2015, on a slow night in Bagotville, we had 27,000 attacks on our network locally per night on a slow night. On a very heavy night, it went up in the 30,000s of attack on our network at night solely for Bagotville. So we are there because it's below the threshold of kinetic weapons. I think that we have a tendency to kind of brush it under the carpet. We are a nation that is, noble in the sense that we want to provide our citizens with the best social services possible, which I'm fully behind. After we spend a minimum that we need to agree upon, call it 2%, call it 3%, but as after we have ensured our sovereignty and our national security. But so far, it hasn't been done after. It's been done at the detriment of. The military is the largest discretionary portfolio right now of the federal government. Any government that wants to realign the public finances will cut where? In the largest portfolio that is discretionary, that's the military. We should have a bipartisan, tripartisan, call it whatever you want, but a bipartisan defense plan that telegraphs what we're going to spend when, so our industry can develop in R&D, get ready, as I mentioned, get ready to bid, and so we can keep the billions of dollars that we're going to invest in Canada, but also just to make sure that at the end of the day, we remain a sovereign nation, master of our own destiny. Did I answer the question, Frederic?
Absolutely. We're just seeing this lack of political leadership. I think amongst ourselves in our communities, we understand what needs to be done. But as we're seeing in the election here, right, the defense platforms that were put forward by both main parties are very similar and don't really address the overall the overarching threat as to the why. Nobody's talking about the why. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvain. Jeff Daly, you got a question on deterrence by punishment?
Hi there, sir.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes. So my question is, what are your thoughts on deterrence by punishment and Canada getting into the nuclear arms race or into the nuclear game? Seeing as how, I mean, sorry, in my experience, I spent 4 years down at NORAD. It's really opened my eyes because with the US and given this political climate, my personal opinion, I'm retired now as well. My personal opinion is Big Brother won't come to help us.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to protect ourselves, and deterrence by punishment is a pretty good option in my mind. Thoughts, sir?
Yes. It is eye-opening to serve in the United States. Canada cannot, again, I do not want to get political, but there's always kind of some element of truth in Mr. Trump's comments when he talks about Canada being the 51st states and says, well, Canada cannot ensure is national, its sovereignty. We are, pretty much defending them. So why don't they become a state? So there's some truth to that in the sense that right now, today, we cannot conduct our own sovereignty missions without the United States. We cannot. We cannot defend what we claim our country alone. I think if most Canadians were aware of that, the Air Force is modernizing. Soon we'll have a new strategic tanker transport aircraft, and we'll be able to launch 2 CF-18 to intercept a Russian strategic bomber that gets close to our territorial waters on our own. But today, if 2 CF-18 get scrambled in the middle of the night, we cannot do this without the US on several fronts, period dot. So, whether or not we want to get back into the nuclear realm, I say back because, we didn't, the US on land that Canada gave to the US temporarily had nuclear weapons surrounded by Canadian soil at some of our fighter bases during the Cold War, but they were technically on US land, protected by US police force. And as soon as they would cross over and get on the jet, then Canada would fly the jets and would have operational command of the jets. But the weapons would be American weapons coming from US soil, even though the bomb dumps were defined as US soil. Now, as long as we are part of an integrated, to me, an integrated air and missile defense approach with our brothers to the south, because I get that right now we're very sensitive, and we find the current U.S. administration not trustworthy. But military to military, day in day out, we still work together to defend the North American aerospace. In NORAD, day in day out. Today, like today, we have 500 families in the U.S. Working to defend the northern continent and approaches. Same with the U.S. military members in Canada right now, stationed across some of our wings on exchange in the NORAD organization. So to me, we need to make ourselves indispensable, not expendable. So we need to just pull our share. And I think that truly the U.S., if we pulled more of our share, the U.S. would be more maybe inclined to help us. Help you, and the sky will help you, right? There's some extent where you're freeloading, where someone will say, okay, well, that's enough, right? I will help you once, I'll help you twice, but eventually I'll stop if you want to help yourself. As a nation, simplistically, this is where we're at. We've been neglecting the most fundamental responsibilities for decades. Should I dare talk about the F-35? We've been part of the F-35 since the late 1990s. We signed the production, sustainment, and follow-on development MOU for the Joint Strike Fighter in 2006. We first made the decision to purchase the F-35 in 2010. The government fell over it. Here we are in 2025, and we're conducting the 5th assessment of the F-35. By the time our F-35s are fielded, we'll be 20 years behind all the closest allies that are now 5th gen operating at the fifth generation level, and they're already at the sixth, thinking about the sixth and seventh generation of technology, while we are struggling to implement the fifth generation technology. We have to move forward, and we need to invest more if we want to have the deterrence. Now, the nuclear question is way above my pay grade. I think there are ways for us to pull our weight without going nuclear. I mean, nuclear armed, but we need to be fully integrated and pull our share to truly be a partner of choice, a responsible partner, both within NORAD and within NATO. That's what I have for you, Jeff.
All right. Thanks for answering my question, sir.
Thanks, Sylvain. We have a question from Jim Cox. I'm wondering, Jim, if you can summarize the preamble to your question that you put in the chat box and then come up with a telling question for Sylvain. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you for that. It's really interesting, the detail there. I still have the, I guess it's the philosophical problem with this whole story, in that we always have talked about the capabilities. We haven't talked about the capacity of our capabilities. And we still, at the end of the day, have no plan of how we are going to carry out the protection and defense of Canada as a whole. If we have a look at the map of the world,
Yes.
a lot of countries, or a majority of the countries, have been invaded over time, history, and they have embedded in their sort of genes and DNA a mindset of protection and defense of the state. That isn't the case here in Canada. So in my mind, until we have a cohort of leaders who are civilians as well as military, who can in some way produce what we had a long time ago in terms of the mobilization plans, I plan a grand strategic plan, how we plan on fighting at home and stop this preoccupation with all this expeditionary stuff. Let's focus in the first instance at home here and get it sorted out. And if we manage to do it right, I think we could end up with a new structure of forces in Canada. It might be a larger Air Force, a larger sort of Navy, and the Army would be predicated more on the reserves, who would have a role in defending and fighting at home. In the mix of all that, I could see a special arm or a separate arm of cyber. So anyway, that is more of a rant, I suppose, than a question.
No, I guess it makes me question how clear I was, but this is what I think. When I say we need to defend our backyard first, defend our homeland first before we go expeditionary, I think exactly the same as you. Lieutenant General Wright, the commander of the Army, is looking at how he's going to modernize the Canadian Army, how he's going to purchase ground-based air defense. Well, I saw him 2 weeks ago. I mean, the Army plays a key role in the ground-based air defense. They need to purchase something that we can defend, like the national capital, if need be, that can defend a G7 summit in Canada, that can defend an Olympic, should we want to have an Olympic, so we can create an Iron Dome or be part of the famous Golden Dome. But we need to have the capabilities, I totally agree, to defend our nation first. And not only from military threats and from potential adversaries, but look at how bad we've been hit with national disasters of increasing strength and frequency on a large scale, from forest fires to floods and everything. These are just going to get worse, and the military can help with that. Even though it's not our primary role, let's not kid ourselves. When Canadians are suffering at home in their cities, either due to flood or forest fires, and the provinces don't have the manpower to take care of it, who are they going to call? Not Ghostbusters, but the Canadian military. So I agree 100% with kind of your philosophy and train of thought. We say the words that is, we need to protect Canada first, we need to protect North America second, and then, about six down, priority down is NATO alliances and go ahead. But we have a tendency to think expeditionarily before we think of protecting our own backyard and our families at home. Now, I'd like to remind you, though, that we've seen military threats in the St. Lawrence River, U-boats sinking, naval ships, actually dropping off spies, German spies that went and looked and did a recce in the Saguenay region where three-wing Bagotville was created in World War II to actually defend the aluminum production plant, which produced 70 to 90% of all Allied aluminum requirements to produce the bombers required in the United States and in England to support the war effort against the Nazi regime. And at the time, the Northern Quebec aluminum plants were taking between 70 and close to 90% of the total electricity production of the nation when we were mobilized for World War II. So I think that we're being short-sighted and extremely. We don't teach history. We don't teach the cost that we paid for the peace that we enjoy today. And to me, I'm happy to be in a peaceful nation. I'm happy to be in the nation that we are at. But we need to rebalance the narrative, our priorities, and if we enjoy the values that we prone at home and abroad, we need to be ready to stand guard and defend them if we're asked to. And this is where we fail. I hope this helps, Jim.
Yes, and thank you. And in detail, I just think if we were ever hit with anything from anybody, I think in the idea of defense of the nation too, there is the problem internal in crime, for organized crime, trends, and that all is part of the bigger package of the threat to Canada. And
It is.
And as you were speaking earlier on the missiles and that, I still think our stations at Alert and Masset and Gander are targets that are about to be destroyed in the first hour.
They are, because this is why I said that from an enemy's perspective, there's no differentiation between Canada and the United States. They need to fight their way through Canada. And like, for example, the new over-the-horizon radar that we're going to build, it's going to be one of the prime targets. What do you do if you want to do anything to any nation? You want to, kill their ears and eyes. Make sure that they can't see, they can't hear anything, and then you have, you're home free to do what you want to do. And obviously, it's going to be the same. So, yeah, it's something that we need to think about without being called warmongers or militaristic in nature. I don't consider myself militaristic. I would not necessarily want us to spend the same amount of GDP that the US is spending on its military, right? But I think that we all agree, I'm sure that everyone on this call agrees that we need to spend a minimum, an absolute minimum of 2% and or more, and never go dip below it. No matter what happens, we should not be able, you cannot touch on security, on national security and sovereignty capabilities for your nation. It's just a given that it's your insurance policy. No matter what you do, you can't touch that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvain. I'll turn the floor over to Sarah. Sarah, you've got a question concerning military objectives, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Thank you for a great talk. I was just wondering what you thought the objectives are of Russia and China in the Arctic, I guess primarily, but elsewhere as well. Now and looking forward, what do you think they want?
Yep. Well, the North is opening up. The Northwest Passage is getting more and more like a sailable time every year. And now, before you ask me why does an aviator worry so much about the seas, is because, well, we are the ones often that patrol, right? With the long-range patrols, the fighters are the ones that operate out there on rapid notice to move. We have helicopters on all of our ships, so there's a very important nexus to the aviation. So I think they want to protect and protect the a passage to the north and make sure that they have as much flexibility as they can get for their own purposes without necessarily adhering to what we would claim, for example, as our sovereignty through the Northwest Passage, which go through the archipelagos of what we call our Canadian country, domestic country. And we claim, you know, most, I would say, reasonable nations understand the principle of continental shelf, like the exclusion zone of a nation stops where the continental shelf ends in the sea, and we can claim that as sovereign to a nation. Well, I think that Russia wants to challenge that. And I think everyone thought it was funny in 2007 when the Russian sub planted a titanium flag 4,200 meters below the sea level on the continental shelf that we, Canada, claim at its sovereign shelf. I was not laughing then. I sure as hell am not laughing now. And Russia's been very steadfast and open and transparent about what they do. They just want to reblaze the glory of the USSR and flex their muscles and grow the empire to where it was or beyond. So I'm really concerned when they start playing close to us, when they are militarizing all the islands that get close to the North Pole or where alert is. And because they have long-range missiles now, you know, they can shoot airplanes that are flying in domestic Canadian airspace that we claim today. I am concerned about that. I think that folks that are not concerned about it are just maybe they just don't know about it. But the world that we live in is a world of real politics where military power matters. So I guess this is where this is where I stand as a, you know, as the North is thawing, there will be the nations that will transition from the latest gas and petroleum that will be able to exploit the last reserve of petroleum, gas, and natural resources to whatever energy source we're going to go next. Whoever controls the last bit will have the upper end. And the North, with the North opening up, Russia, China, they want to have access to the large reserves of hydrocarbons that are out there, of resources that are bound to be found. And really that at the end of the day, they just want to protect more exploitation for themselves to feed their ambitions on the world stage. See, I have no problems if China, for example, wants to improve the condition of life of its population, wants to just become maybe a bit more respected, stronger nation. I do have a problem when they start claiming sovereignty of international waters of other countries, and they just actually take them overnight and start building airstrips, arming them, and all of a sudden they become force that we can't touch. I have a problem with that modus operandi for China, but for any other nations that decide to do that.
Thank you.
Yes, did I answer your question, Sarah?
Yes, you did very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Sylvain. We're at the top of the hour, but there are a couple more questions, one of which I'd like to squeeze in.
Yes.
Rafia Khan and Kit Brand have introduced a new theme about security rather than national defense per se. And you've spoken very eloquently about military readiness. But if you can broaden the theme considerably, there are other states of readiness to be considered in a national security model. Medical readiness.
Yes.
Immigration readiness. Who are these scientific teams that are coming over from wherever?
Yes.
Fiscal readiness.
Totally.
Currency readiness. The list can go on. I appreciate that you may not have a PhD in economics from Oxford, but you do have an ability to do threat assessment and readiness assessment. Can you share some thoughts on how these states of readiness might be defined, and advanced?
Yeah, well, when we talk about strategy and the levers of power, we always talk usually about the dynasty, the diplomacy, the information, the military, the economic, and the culture aspect of any nation. That are the levers of power of a nation. So I might not today. I focused a bit more on the military threat, but obviously we need to get better from a comprehensive perspective to be able to play with our economy. I think China and Russia are really good because the way they are controlled, they're not a diplomacy. They don't need to reach a consensus. They control all the levers. You see Russia or China, if they want something, not only will they apply military power to it, but they will apply economic power and coercion to get what they want, right? They're very coordinated. And here I'm not talking about space assets and the space domain and the cyber aspect. Like when Russia is really famous for, going on a huge cyber attack before going in a specific country to try to negate everything that you talked about. Create chaos through information, economics, the science. Like we are not sheltered from that. We have lost some of our networks that some of our defense and research facilities have lost for years. We know they've been hacked. We think it's about China. We think it's China that hacked them, but it is happening. Where all of a sudden you lose control and your most kind of secret drives and everything get hacked somehow. So yes, security is really comprehensive. No longer can we compartmentalize the military, the economic, the cyber, the space, the science. It's all together. We see definitely China and Russia, which are of most concern right now, and I've named those two nations quite a bit, but they use all of them together in a very coordinated fashion. They're very good at it, and we need to look at how we will do that from a national perspective. But again, we're really in a democracy like ours, where we believe in the rule of law, both international and domestic rule of law. Doesn't matter which province you believe in. We don't have a tendency to think that way, right? To coordinate all of these efforts together, but we will need to do it when something bad enough occurs. So it's something that we need to think about.
Thank you. Excellent point. Both Russia and China have what we call command economy. We don't.
Yep.
Market. Okay, so that's one of the downsides of a market economy.
Yes.
And transiting from a market economy in peacetime to wartime, I guess we'd have to look back to the travails of World War I and II. Thank you very much. If I can impose on you for a few more minutes, Thomas Gardner's got a question. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sir. So we served together. I'm a soon-to-be retired lieutenant colonel in the engineer branch. I was CO North for all real property across the three territories plus Labrador up until last September. So like my question is so infrastructure logistics is such a huge piece of the fight across the north into NORAD, and you probably know where I'm coming from. So our infrastructure is aging all across Canada, but on the infrastructure side of things in the Defense Department, it's even worse. We're talking catastrophic failures here in the future. So how does that play into the fight, and where do you think we should go or move forward on that? And you can pick logistics if you want to stay out of where I'm at as well.
It's great. Logistics, a line of communication resilience is one of the greatest vulnerabilities of all the Western nations due to the globalization of trade. Look at if you wanted to stop the car production, to use a non-military one, right? You can hit a car in transport through the 7 trips that it is going to do between the Canada and the US. That's the car as a unit itself, what you call the car, but the parts actually doing the crossing of the borders hundreds of times for the thousands of parts that are in a car. So how do you want to stop the car production? You don't need to go for the biggest widget. You go for the small enablers, certain fasteners, and you can't put the cars together and you're done, right? It's the same for military. I will use a very simple one, like entire economy, communication systems, are based on a few hidden optic fiber cables that lay on the seabed. Russia keeps cutting them. You don't need to go after the exquisite satellites. You don't need to go in the country. If you just cut those wires, you paralyze. And if you manage to cut all of them, you can paralyze the Western world in a heartbeat. So absolutely, you're right. Logistics is another huge issue. We have a very, very large country. You talk about logistics, but just look at the state of all the armories across Canada. They're literally falling apart. They have mesh nets that are welded, not welded, but that are screwed into the armories so the bricks don't fall at several locations. It is very humiliating, really, to see all our infrastructure. It goes back to the fact that we simply don't seem to have believed that we need to invest in all of that. Because the cumulative effect of not investing and real property and the centralization of real property, why did we do that? Because the operational commanders did not have enough budgets. And what did they do? Is they jeopardized infrastructure to make sure they could keep operating and keep some sort of force readiness at the cost of aging infrastructure. And then we realized that if everyone did that successfully, but in succession, then you never invest in your armories, you never invest in your infrastructure. The next thing you know is you never maintain them, and now you are where we are today, right? So that's why we centralized the real property portfolio. That's why we organized ourselves, but we still don't have more money. We do not manage our infrastructure, we manage urgencies and critical emergencies because we just don't have enough money to actually do justice to to our logistic chains, but to everything that support the logistics, our hubs, lines of communication. We have barely enough money to move stuff left and right via one single route. We cannot start addressing redundancy by having redundant routes, but it's somewhere we need to go. And if we look at there's a lot that we can do internally that would, as we are looking at a potentially slowing down economy, if Canada wanted to, could address several of the issues that I just mentioned that you brought up, Thomas, that would inject money into the economy, into the workforce, but that would help us build that resiliency, that redundancy that we require just to be more secure.
Really good point, sir. And if I could add to the contract, it's all contracted in the north. We don't have the troops to push forward. The industry in Canada, Canadian construction industry, is already short trades, and they're going to be short tens of thousands of trades here in the next 10 years. And it gets a lot worse as the further north you go.
Yes.
So good luck in trying to build that new infrastructure. If we didn't start 10 years ago, we're looking at a long ways out too.
For sure. But build it and they will come. If you start investing the money, I'm sure that we'll have maybe foreign workers that can come in. I know it's not going to help the housing issue, but you got to start somewhere. And doing nothing is by itself an action that I think we should not contemplate, because then we don't solve anything. You got to start somewhere.
Absolutely, sir. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for your service.
You too, sir.
I'd like to conclude our evening with one last question from me. Technology has collapsed time and space. The Caroline Affair of 1839 set out the idea of an imminent attack and would only take 4 days to sail across Lake Ontario before there could be a use of force. But now a threat is so close to an armed attack that I have to ask you, as a force commander, how do you decide, getting inside your OODA loop, how do you decide when to employ lethal force? How do you distinguish a threat from a Kizil missile from an armed attack of such a missile?
So the detection itself, if you are into the detection business, then your intelligence failed. In the sense that there's a lot of exquisite capabilities on the intelligence side that hopefully will allow us to detect before anything is done. We'll be able to detect mobilization and such. And that's why the partnership that we have with the Five Eyes partner and with the NATO nations and the like thinking nations like France, for example, or Japan, or is so vital, because we need to collectively work together, and regularly we share some information about areas for concern before physical actions are taken. But you are totally right. The OODA loop is now reduced very rapidly. That's why in the US, and I talked about command and control, cloud-based command and control that is being rolled out across NORAD. We're using AI to help us differentiate from the chaff to what could potentially be a real threat, so that we can advise whoever the authority for a specific engagement is. It's at a very high level in Canada and the United States. I'm not going to say more than that, but and there are folks that travel around with a red phone who are the authority to give us lethal authorization on that. But it is a concern, because as time goes by, as intelligence, artificial intelligence kicks in, that will, instead of measuring in minutes, it used to be in hours, now it's in minutes, it's going to be in seconds or microseconds eventually. And we will need a lot of help with the assistance of artificial intelligence to help us stay ahead.
Very good. Well, go on, please.
Wait.
Carry on.
It's a Gordian knot. It's not an easy. All you can hope for is just to remain slightly ahead of the evolving threat. America, I use America because it was, still the superpower, for pride itself for being leaps and bounds to have supremacy in several domains, but it's harder and harder for them to claim that supremacy, and that advantage, that relative advantage, is actually shrinking as technology evolves.
Right. Well, thank you very much for a brilliant evening and some really sparkling exchanges of questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela, Mr. Howard, and everyone. Thank you for being here, and keep doing what you're doing, asking very pertinent questions. You are part of the solution, and we need our political masters. We need to hold them to account and force them to better educate the Canadian population and have these discussions on these very, very difficult topics. Thank you very much, folks.